It's my great pleasure to introduce, indeed reintroduce, Carl Islam as our speaker this afternoon. Many of you will know Carl as both mediator and mediation advocate. He's a practicing barrister who works really in addition to Essex Court. He really works out of Leicester. But the most interesting feature of Carl today, of course, is that he holds a diploma in art and law um, from the Institute of the same name. Um, and we have this very, very interesting talk now on the mediation of cultural heritage disputes, which is an area in which Carl has some considerable expertise. And without further ado, Carl, take it away. Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
Andrew, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all hear me clearly. Um, just to just to reassure you, you don't need to write anything down today. You might need to draw something, which I'll show you in a minute, but you don't need to write anything down because my speaking notes are now posted on the Mediation of Cultural Heritage Disputes page of my website, which is www.carlislam.co.uk. And for those of you who have difficulty sleeping at night and want to get more of this subject, they run to nearly 32 pages in length. So it's not for the faint-hearted to print off, but you can see them there. And if you want to, you're very welcome to print them off. There's a diagram I'm going to show you, which will block out my face later on in the talk, which I'll hold up for about a minute. It's a methodology that I've sketched really for the approach that a mediator can take in a cultural heritage dispute. I'm just going to outline the structure of the talk, then I've got a couple of preliminary points, and then I'll get started. So the talk is divided into two parts. In part one, I will introduce you to four themes in cultural heritage disputes, which are methodology, classification, and terminology, that will also lead us into who is involved in these disputes, how they arise, and why they're important. Because ultimately, in these disputes, what's at stake is knowledge. Thirdly, theories of restitution. Restitution means return. And finally, cognitive errors, which I spoke about briefly last year as well. And then in part two, I will take you into the head of each participant in a cultural heritage dispute by discussing the dimensions of cultural heritage disputes. These dimensions shape each participant's paradigm, and they're interactive and operate with each other. So I'd just like to say a few words about this. I'm actually writing a book about all of this at the moment, but I'm only about halfway through my research. So I'll have more to put in writing about this, hopefully sometime next year. So just a couple of preliminary points just to set the scene. The first point to grasp is that the participants' paradigms, their position on what is at stake in a dispute and how they view it, is shaped in cultural heritage disputes by multiple dynamic forces. Some commentators describe these dynamic forces as being parameters. I think about them, analyze them, and discuss them as being dimensions of a dispute. So therefore, cultural heritage disputes are multi-dimensional. Now, they're also international because, they are also international. So they are also intercultural. However, the critical distinction between a cultural heritage dispute and, for example, a commercial dispute is that what is at stake is something you cannot put a monetary value on. As I said, it's ultimately about knowledge. The next preliminary point, which is just to focus and to explain the prism through which I'm looking at the mediation of cultural heritage disputes today, is that while researching the book, I discovered that while there are these 4 forms of institutional mediation, which are available to state actors and non-state actors, including indigenous groups in these disputes for mediation, the take-up is very low. There are a number of reasons for that. They're set out in the notes. So if you wish to educate yourself about that, you can go to the speaking notes. The reason I mention this is that because it's low, that means the default position for using a method of mediation is ad hoc, bespoke mediation. So that's what I'm talking about today. That's the context in which I'm outlining mediation and mediation advocacy tools. The next preliminary point is that in these cultural heritage disputes, while there is some evidence published and available about the outcome of these disputes, either in face-to-face negotiation, which is the most common form of ADR, or in mediation, whether that's institutional or ad hoc, I can't discern a particular typology. Also, this field, mediation in relation to cultural heritage disputes, is relatively recent and is still evolving. So nobody is an expert in this, and there's no one right or wrong way of mediating a cultural heritage dispute. And of course, as all of you who are mediators know, or who have experienced it as mediation advocates, every mediator has their own distinct style, or will develop their own distinctive style, which invariably is a mixture of both facilitative and evaluative mediation. So the methods that I describe today and will write about in the book are going to be based partly on my knowledge as an art and cultural heritage lawyer, and mostly upon first principles of mediation advocacy. Now, I need to stress this: there is no universal blueprint for the mediation of a cultural heritage dispute. In fact, as Art Council England state in their publication, Restitution and Repatriation, a practical guide for museums in England, and I quote, "There is no such thing as a single uniform process or set of procedures which constitute a restitution blueprint, nor is there a single defined goal or endpoint. Rather, responding to a restitution case requires you, the museum, to reconsider your relationship with objects in your collection, their history, origins, and acquisition, and most importantly, the people for whom they may have a special meaning today." We're now going into part 1, and I'm going to start with methodology, and shortly I'll be holding up the diagram. The first proposition I want to state is that in transforming conflict into partnership in a cultural heritage dispute, i.e. by facilitating clear thinking and rational interest-based decision-making, a mediator must first become aware of and understand the dimensions of the dispute itself. As I've said, the dimensions in a cultural heritage dispute are multidisciplinary. So the starting point for parties in dispute who wish to become participants in mediation is therefore to appoint both a mediator and mediation advocates who are capable of understanding the multidisciplinary dimensions at play in the dispute. In mediation, transformation can occur where participants choose to focus on the future, putting the past behind them. In the mediation of the cultural heritage dispute, this involves the creation of what I call a new paradigm of restitution. In other words, a new way of thinking about whether or not to keep or return an artifact in your collection as a museum. Now, how to bring that about, how to bring about the joint creation of a new paradigm of restitution is the fundamental challenge that confronts a mediator in a cultural heritage dispute. And of course, success in overcoming that challenge will depend upon the interaction that takes place during the process between the mediator, the participants, and the mediation advocates working as a joint enterprise. Now, to demonstrate how ad hoc mediation works in a cultural heritage dispute, I've sketched this diagram. I hope you can see it clearly. It's going to block out my face for a while as I bring it closer to the screen. It consists, it's very easy to draw. It's a triangle. You've got the mediator at the top, and in a two-participant mediation, you've got one participant on the left at the base of the triangle and the other one on the right. The triangle is enclosed by a circle, which is effectively a highway. It's a highway into another dimension. It's a highway into the actual dimensions of the dispute. The dimensions of the dispute are represented by the orange semicircle. So what happens in cultural heritage dispute, what I'm saying is, in private sessions, mediator can move out of the triangle, through the circle, into the orange semicircle, into each dimension in order to understand it, and then back out of the semicircle, into the triangle, into private sessions and or into plenary sessions, in order to try and transform the way the participants think about what is at stake in the dispute. They do that, a mediator does that in this model by using what I call the 3 R's: reflect, reality test, and reframe, to steer the participants, one, away from a preconception based upon rights and power, that to optimize gains and minimize losses, they must fight and win, and toward a conception that what is of primary value and importance is in fact their interests, which can be optimized instead of conflict by working together with each other, i.e. as partners in joint and creative problem solving facilitated by the mediator. Thereby, a mediator can facilitate a paradigm shift in a cultural heritage dispute. The mediator does that by enabling each participant to reframe their dispute as being an opportunity, which counterintuitively can be maximized through cooperation instead of conflict. As you will know, but I'll say it anyway, for those who will be watching this on YouTube, the 3 R's involves 1, sincere and patient listening with empathy, so that each participant knows and feels that they have been heard. The second, reality testing. Second is reality testing the assumptions and beliefs underlying each participant's paradigm by playing devil's advocate with their permission, and thereby enabling each participant to become self-aware about the existence of any cognitive errors which may have distorted their paradigm. And I'm going to talk about 2 of them later. One is the floodgates argument and the other is called Orientalism. And the third is reframing a constraint which may have been based upon a cognitive error as being an opportunity. So in summary, the way this methodology in the diagram works is the starting point for the mediator is to understand each participant's paradigm, because that will reveal how the paradigm can be transformed. The mediator must enter each dimension of a dispute in order to both holistically and at a granular level to analyze and understand each paradigm, i.e. by seeing it as each participant does, as if through their eyes. A mediator can then transform each participant's paradigm by steering the dialogue away from rights and power and focusing instead on interests. Next is classification and terminology. This is relevant because what you call something can influence how you think and feel about it, and thus its subjective value significance and relative importance to you. Cultural heritage is the intellectual, artistic, social, and historical record of mankind. In the case of tangible cultural heritage, this is manifest in physical objects. I refer interchangeably to these objects, which include ancient books and manuscripts, as being either artifacts or antiquities. Cultural heritage is of crucial importance to individuals and communities because it forms part of their identity. In other words, cultural heritage is inextricably linked to cultural identity, to who we are. Now, while some commentators describe these claims as being cultural property disputes, as Professor Irene Stamatudi states in her article, Alternative Dispute Resolution and Insights on Cases of Greek Cultural Property, and I quote, "Only a few individuals would disagree with the fact that cultural property is not just about property. It carries with it values and sensitivities on the objects themselves, their place in time and history, their linked territories and countries, their symbolism, functions, and role in relation to the context in which they originally belonged and from which they were plucked. I therefore prefer to describe claims for the restitution, i.e. the return of artifacts and antiquities, as being cultural heritage disputes. These claims arise in a multiplicity of different circumstances, which include plunder during war, acquisition and appropriation during a period of colonial domination, export in breach of a state's patrimonial laws, which vest ownership of certain artifacts found within the borders of that state in that state, and 4, acquisition as a result of the illicit trade in antiquities, i.e. by theft, looting from archaeological sites, and smuggling. Globally, private collectors and museums end up acquiring stolen artifacts and antiquities through the legitimate art and antiquities market. The United Kingdom, the United States, France, and Germany are the biggest art and antiquities markets for illicitly acquired artifacts and antiquities, and are known variously as being either market states or as importing countries. As the following quotations will illustrate, driven by factors which include conflict, a rise in looting, the insatiable appetite of wealthy private collectors, and the use of trafficking to fund criminal activities, including drugs and terrorism, the scale of the global illicit market in the plunder and sale of artifacts and antiquities has become industrial. Where participants in mediation are state actors, they share a common interest in discouraging the trade by undermining market demand for stolen artifacts and antiquities. I'm going to now give you a series of illustrations and a series of short quotes to illustrate the scale and consequences of the illicit trade in artifacts and antiquities. We're going across 3 continents. We're going to start in Africa. In Mali, for example, it is estimated that 45% of all archaeological sites have been looted. Now, that's not just Mali's loss, that is Africa's loss, because Mali was once a vast empire that spread its language, laws, and customs across the entire continent of Africa, and the region's unique blend of lifestyles from trade and farming to music and dance created a rich cultural identity that is a key part of Africa's broader heritage, as well as creating ancient texts and an intellectual history in cities like Timbuktu, which have contributed significantly to both African and global knowledge. Crossing the Atlantic, in Latin America, looting is so prevalent that entire civilizations have been ripped from the earth and placed onto the international antiquities market before scholars even knew that they existed. From Guatemala alone, as I speak, it is estimated that looters smuggle up to 1,000 ancient artifacts out of the country onto the market each month. Some estimate that looting in Central America employs several million people. We're now moving across the Pacific. More recently, in relation to China, the art and cultural heritage lawyer Leila Amenadola, in an article published in the spring edition this year of the Harvard Art Law Review, stated shockingly that between a 9 out of 10 and, according to another source, 8 out of 10 tombs across the whole of China have been plundered, and that in 2013 it was estimated that 100,000 looters operated in China, and that more than 400,000 ancient graves have been robbed during the past few decades. I'm going to give you 2 quotes now by an academic, and you will not be surprised by what is said based on what I've just said. In his book, The Settlement of International Cultural Heritage Disputes, Professor Alessandro Cecchi cites a quote from a representative of the Institute of Archaeology at University College London, and I quote, "It's commonly accepted by those of us who work in the field that 80 to 90% of the material on the market is illegal." He also cites Thomas Hoving, a former director of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, who reportedly said that, and I quote, "Almost every antiquity that has arrived in America in the past 20 years has broken the laws of the country from which it came. Claims for restitution involve a range of state, sub-state, i.e. indigenous group, tribal group, private law actors and other stakeholders. Claims for restitution brought by state actors and indigenous groups typically fall into 2 categories. They are either national treasures or they are sacred objects. A primary example of the former, i.e. of a national treasure, is the claim brought by Iceland against Denmark for the return of the Icelandic manuscripts. Originally written on vellum, i.e. calfskin, and later on paper, these manuscripts represented Iceland's great heritage of medieval prose and poetry and symbolized Iceland's nationhood and cultural identity. One of the ancient manuscript treasures returned to Iceland in 1971 by the Royal Library in Copenhagen is the Hlaðabók Codex, which is a compilation of sagas made in the north of Iceland in the 1390s. A page from the Codex shows that at the start of the Grænlingda saga, which tells the story of the expedition of Leif the Lucky to Vinland, North America, and of the Norse discovery of the New World 500 years before Columbus. A textbook example of a claim brought by indigenous groups for the return of sacred objects, which often include claims for the return of human remains, is the Willamette meteorite known as Tomanawas. Tomanawas is sacred to the ancient Clackamas tribe from Grand Ronde Reservation in Oregon. It is also the largest meteorite ever found in the United States and the 6th largest meteorite ever found in the world. To the Clackamas, the meteorite was sent by the Sky people and represented the union of sky, earth, and water. It was an important tribal object, and they wished to have traditional use of it. The tribe had been forced to abandon it upon being relocated in 1855. The meteorite is thought to be 10,000 years old and is an important and unique scientific object. Eventually, a negotiated settlement was agreed between the museum and the tribe, whereby the sacred meteorite could be shared. It would remain as the centerpiece of the Rose Center for Earth and Space in the New York Museum of Natural History, and the tribe would have annual ceremonial access to the museum and to the meteorite. Thus, through a process of negotiation, the dispute about possession of this sacred and unique object was resolved in a manner whereby both scientific study and native rights were preserved and respected. Next, I'm going to speak very briefly about theories of restitution under international law. Two theories have shaped the participants' paradigms in cultural heritage disputes. First, in the frequently quoted words of the preamble to the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Heritage in the event of armed conflict, and I quote, "Antiquities are the cultural heritage of all mankind." This idea that antiquities belong to all mankind has its philosophical root in the Western liberal theory of cultural property internationalism. That doctrine is used by museums to justify the retention of artifacts. The opposite theory, which is based upon Article 2 of the UNESCO Convention 1970 on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property, and the preamble, is that cultural objects belong within the boundaries of the source country or state of origin. This doctrine, which is used to support claims for restitution, is called cultural nationalism. Next, I'm going to say a few very brief words about cognitive errors. Cognitive error can distort a participant's paradigm. That's why I'm talking about it. A cognitive error is a failure to think clearly, i.e. it is a routine barrier to logic. There are many of them in the context of claims for the restitution of cultural heritage disputes, including the first theory of international law I just related to you. If the mediator and the mediation advocates understand the principles of cognitive error, then they can save the participants from themselves, thereby avoiding destructive behavior, which does not help the participants to get what they each need, i.e. through facilitated negotiation in mediation. So this is a powerful tool for use by both mediators and mediation advocates. I'm going to give you one example now, which is the floodgates argument, and then later in the talk, I'm going to mention another, which is linked to another dimension, which is linked to a dimension of cultural heritage disputes, which is called Orientalism. The floodgates argument is a primary example. It holds that returning cultural heritage would empty museums. The error is rooted in the Pandora's box metaphor, which suggests that one small opening will lead to uncontrollable consequences. However, most claims for return are historically unique, and there is no widespread plan to empty museums. Instead, such claims present an opportunity to rethink museum missions, as returning objects doesn't mean their disappearance from the world of museums. The core of the floodgates argument is the idea that returning a few objects will necessarily open the door to a torrent of other claims, leading to a mass exodus of cultural artifacts from Western museums. This fear of setting a precedent is a well-worn argument used to resist restitution. However, Each case in restitution is historically unique, making it difficult to transpose one agreement onto another. So logically, it does not follow that restitution will create any kind of precedent. In fact, the current practice of returns does not suggest that massive transfers are imminent, and there does not appear to be a plan by requesting countries to ask for massive returns. So the idea that museums would be emptied, as we often hear politicians say, is based on a misinformed premise. It is based on a false idea. That ends part one. We're now going into the head of each participant in part two, where I'm going to discuss the dimensions of cultural heritage disputes. In my diagram, you will recall that these dimensions are represented by this single orange semicircle. That represents one dimension. If this were a three-dimensional dimension, because I've identified 7 to date, you would have 7 of these encircling, ringing the purple circle, and they would all be interconnecting, as you'll learn shortly. The dimensions are as follows. The first is the human dimension. The second is the existential dimension. The third is the object dimension. The fourth is the legal dimension. The fifth is the ethical dimension. The sixth and penultimate is the political dimension. And the most important one, which is the last one, is the decision-making dimension. The human dimension. The values, significance, and importance ascribed to an artifact, which may be historic, scientific, educational, aesthetic, or financial, depend upon the subjective meanings placed upon it by individuals and communities. So the human dimension of a cultural heritage dispute describes the special feelings that an artifact evokes because of its symbolic, emotional, religious, and historical qualities. As Professor Alessandro Cecchi states in his book about the settlement of international cultural heritage disputes, and I quote, "This human dimension is at stake in all cases, whether involving artworks taken by force or deceit or not. Cultural objects have no intrinsic value in the sense that they cannot be defined solely by their physical characteristics. The values ascribed to them depend on the meanings placed upon them by individuals and communities. It is precisely because of these meanings that works of art and antiquities attract the interests of museum goers, institutions, states, and other stakeholders. For some, cultural objects are repositories of information relating to human history. Others regard them as possessing or expressing religious or spiritual qualities. For others, cultural objects are chattels that can be treated as any other commodity in financial terms. Heritage's value is therefore relational. This explains why disputes involving cultural objects are both more likely to arise and more difficult than in the case of mundane goods to resolve. Next is the existential dimension, where the recipient of a claim for restitution is a national museum. This is about the mission of the museum and its values as a cultural heritage institution, i.e. the purposes for which it exists and the people whose interests it exists to serve. That in turn is linked to museum ethics and best practice in claims for the return of cultural artifacts, which in itself in turn can affect funding through non-compliance and popular support by visitors, i.e. by the general public. Where the artifact being claimed possesses a dual or hybrid cultural identity, this dimension is also connected to the human dimension. That is because others feel that historically the artifact forms part of their cultural identity and heritage and belongs to them. In his book, Who Owns Antiquities, Museums and the Battle Over Ancient Heritage, James Cuno illustrates the problem of cultural identity as follows, and I quote, "Are antiquities Italian because they derive from cultures said to have developed autonomously in the region of present-day Italy, or have we simply chosen to identify them that way? They look like things we know to have been made by ancient peoples in the region of what is now some nearly 2,000 years later, Italy. Of course, they also look like things made in Greece, which in turn look like things made in Egypt, which themselves bear a resemblance to things made in the ancient Near East. And then do we see resemblances to things made more or less at the same time in Persia, in the steppes of Russia and Central Asia, not to mention across the Levant and Northern Africa and up into Europe by way of the Balkans. And of course, too, each of these influences comprises currents of others, such that we can trace the identity of Italian works of art through a series of artistic and cultural encounters over much of the known world and over hundreds and hundreds of years. Next is the object dimension. The object dimension is both the tangible and intangible aspects of an artifact which are inseparable and crucial to resolving the dispute, and the physical artifact itself, which may have intrinsic value for archaeologists and historians. The intangible dimension encompasses the symbolic, spiritual, and historical values attached to the artifact by a community, such as its role in identity, continuity of traditions, or rituals. So effectively resolving cultural heritage disputes requires acknowledging both the physical object and the human cultural significance that object holds. Sometimes an impasse can also be overcome in negotiations by adopting a neutral object-centric approach, i.e. by putting the object at the center and asking the question, what is in the best interest for the artifact itself, based upon three considerations: which participant can best preserve it, which participant can best glean the historical, scientific, cultural, and aesthetic truths from it, which participant can best grant public access to it. Next is the legal dimension. The legal dimension is the framework of legal duties, powers, and discretions within which a lawful decision can be made by a participant about the terms of a deal for restitution. Museum trustees cannot simply voluntarily dispose of an artifact in their collections, whatever the merits of the moral or ethical case for restitution, unless the disposal is lawful. As Sir Anthony Mason explains in his article, Ethical Dilemmas for Charities, Museums, and the Conscionable Disposal of Art, and I quote, "Although the law is not blind to moral claims, trustees and those who control charitable institutions can only satisfy such claims within the framework of the law. The statutes governing museums and galleries impose restraints on disposal of objects in the institution's collections. The statutory restraints imposed on national museums and galleries are in general more severe than the restraints imposed on other museums and galleries. The British Museum Act 1963 will serve as an example. Subsections 1 and 3 of Section 3 requires the museum to keep the objects comprised in its collections within its authorised repositories, and so far as appears to the trustees practicable, to make them available for inspection when required. Section 5 enables the trustees to dispose of objects vested in them, but only in very limited circumstances which do not extend to the satisfaction of a moral claim for return or repatriation. Consequently, disposal of an object forming part of the museum's collection simply for the purposes of satisfying a moral claim would be a breach of the museum statute, unless authority for such a disposal could be obtained under the Charities Act, the Regulatory Reform Act 2001, or pursuant to statutory amendment. Therefore, the critical question is whether the trustees have the power, i.e. the lawful right to make a disposition of trust property. Furthermore, in the exercise of that power, they must exercise it for the purpose for which it was given, i.e. to further the purposes of the trust. Another legal constraint in this dimension is about whether a duty of restitution exists under international law. The constraint is this: the restitution of artifacts removed during colonial occupation is entirely outside the scope of the UNESCO 1970 Convention. So these claims cannot be litigated. They can only be resolved through dialogue and negotiation. Even where a claim can be litigated, as Irina Stamatudi explains in her article, Alternative Dispute Resolution and Insight on Cases on Greek Cultural Property, litigation in cultural heritage disputes is disadvantageous compared to mediation because, and I quote, resort to courts, that is mostly national courts, necessarily means submission to rigid national laws, which does not always take into account the particularities of cultural property. On most occasions, it also means that the parties have no choice on the jurisdiction, i.e. which court hears the case, on the applicable law, i.e. which law applies, and on the judges who decide the case. Other litigation risks in cultural heritage disputes include standing, the doctrine of renvoi, the non-enforceability of a foreign penal law in an English court, admissibility of evidence, including expert evidence, and evidential difficulties in discharging the burden of proof. Next is the ethical dimension. Then after that, we've got two more, and then it's just the conclusion. The ethical dimension is linked to museum codes, codes of practice, and ethical guidance in restitution claims, reparative justice, state practice in restitution claims, and principles of restitution, which can be extrapolated from international treaties and customary rules of international law, i.e. norms of international law. This dimension is also linked, as I mentioned earlier, to the cognitive era of Orientalism. Orientalism has influenced the attitudes of some museum curators toward restitution in claims brought by source states of origin, and involves a patronizing Western view of Eastern cultures, portraying them as static and inferior, which can manifest itself as a belief that Western institutions are better custodians, and the framing of cultural items as belonging to a universal history rather than a specific cultural history. This framework can lead to a failure to recognize the harm of colonial collection practices and an inability to fully grasp the cultural and political importance of restitution to the communities of origin. Orientalism can lead to a reluctance to engage in meaningful dialogue and a tendency to delay or deny restitution requests. In my book, I'll be dedicating an entire chapter to contemporary ethical principles of restitution, which can be used in mediation as a tool for the joint creation by the participants of a new paradigm of restitution. The penultimate dimension is the political dimension. I don't have much to say about this. As Maria Shahadi and Calliope Fuseki state in their article, The Politics of Culture and the Culture of Politics, examining the role of politics and diplomacy in cultural property disputes, and I quote, cases of cultural property disputes involving states are often affected by the international political scene in several ways. First, the relation between the two countries can either facilitate the resolution of such a dispute, in the case of good relations, in collaboration at a governmental level or through established agreements, or create obstacles for settlement if such relations are not in place, for example, between the United States and Iran. Second, cultural property disputes may be affected by current political agendas, either in the wider context of international relations or in internal political scenarios. So, for example, in international politics, cultural heritage can be used as a tool of bargaining in geopolitical negotiation. Another common and lesser known aspect of the political dimension in cultural heritage disputes is the use by state actors of cultural sanctions to bring a claimant state, either as leverage to bring a claimant state to the negotiating table or to obtain their agreement to restitution. For example, the practice which is quite common in Egypt and in Turkey of where there are still a vast amount of unexcavated vast amounts of unexcavated archaeological sites, to withhold licenses to excavate linked to restitution. So they use it as leverage. The final dimension, which is the most important, is the decision-making dimension. I say that this is the most important because this is the bridge between ongoing conflict and resolution. It's in this dimension that creative deal structuring solutions can be imagined, explored, and jointly developed and agreed by the participants, being terms of a compromise that satisfy their respective underlying interests to an extent which they can each live with, i.e. that are enough, and which they can also lawfully implement. In other words, it's in this dimension that a balance can be struck between the participants' competing negotiating imperatives, on the one hand of retention and on the other hand of return. The decision-making process followed by Glasgow City Council in the claim brought by the Wounded Knee Survivors Association for the return of the Lakota Ghost Dance shirt provides a decision-making template. The Ghost Dance shirt was taken from the body of a Lakota warrior after the Wounded Knee massacre in 1890 on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. It is a sacred item, which is believed to have spiritual power. In 1891, the ghost shirt was brought to Glasgow by a member of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. In the intervening period between the show and the request for repatriation, Glasgow City Council established a repatriation committee. That committee established five criteria of restitution. When they applied these criteria of restitution to the request for the return of the Lakota Ghost Dance shirt, it transpired, to the shirt, they decided that the request was valid and the request in fact had significant cultural benefits for the city, including an ongoing cultural relationship with the Wounded Knee Survivors Association. The five criteria were: one, the status of those making the request i.e. their right to represent the community to which the object originally belonged. The continuity between the community which created the object and the current community on whose behalf, hundreds of years later, the request was made. The cultural and religious importance of the object to that community. How the object was acquired by the museum and their subsequent and future use. And finally, the fate of the object if returned. The procedure for arriving at a decision about restitution also involved briefing by an academic expert in the provenance and historical background of the artifact, consultation with the council's legal department, who advised that while there was no legal duty to return the artifact, the council had the legal power to transfer ownership of the artifact if it wished. And finally, consultation with members of the museum community. As Mark O'Neill, head of arts and museums for Glasgow City Council, who at the time was also head of curatorial services, remarked following the decision, and I quote, "If museums represent our better selves, our humane values, then we have to admit to the possibility that there may be other values which are more important than that of possession and preservation. Possession in itself cannot be an absolute value, taking precedence over all others. And if our values lead us to preserve an object because of what it tells us about the history of a particular human group, then it is inconsistent not to give that group the respect of at least taking their views seriously. The objects we preserve and the stories they tell reflect our values, what we stand for, how we wish to see ourselves, what we wish to bring with us into the future. A related argument here is that to give one object back creates a precedent and the floodgates will be opened up. The City Council has rejected this argument. It cannot be right to say that the case for returning this group of objects is just, but it cannot be done because future unjust cases may be encouraged. Values are above all a matter of choice, and for values to be real, we must continually make the necessary choices. In Glasgow, our vision of museums is not just as dusty storerooms, but as places where urgent issues of personal and communal meaning and identity can be explored and renegotiated. In the remaining 5 minutes, and I may run slightly over by another 5 if that's permissible, I'm going to make a few concluding remarks. I'm going to begin by stating an analytical framework, and then I'm going to apply the principal elements of that analytical framework to the question, could the claim by Egypt for the return of the Rosetta Stone benefit from mediation? So first, the framework. This is a framework for creating what I described earlier as being a new paradigm of restitution. The academic Jeanette Greenfield argues in the 3rd edition of her book, The Return of Cultural Treasures, and I quote, this is the framework, "An examination of the cases relating to cultural property has clearly indicated that we are really concerned with 3 different issues. 1, conservation, which is an ongoing issue. 2, illicit trading, which is a contemporary issue. And 3, the physical return of cultural property, which may be associated with illicit trading, but is also a historical issue. Therefore, by applying this framework, participants in mediation can explore and discover the existence of common ground and thereby jointly create a new paradigm of institution by engaging in a third-party facilitated dialogue about A, the nature of the object itself, i.e. the artifact in dispute, and B, the circumstances in which the artifact was acquired. Now, of course, before such a mediated dialogue can take place, there has to be a political willingness by all involved in the dispute about the benefits and potential of ad hoc mediation in resolving a cultural heritage dispute. Now, in the wake of the opening of the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo 11 days ago on the 1st of November, there has been a renewed call for the return of the Rosetta Stone to Egypt. The background to the claim was succinctly summarized by Jeanette Greenfield in her book. This is a lengthy quote, but it's important because it gives you the context in which mediation needs to take place. The parties in mediation need to each get out of their trenches on either side of what I'm about to read you. In the spring of 1801, and after the operations of Sir Ralph Abercrombie threatened Cairo, the scholars of the French expedition decided to leave the capital for the safety of Alexandria, taking with them the Rosetta Stone. Under Article 16 of the capitulation of Alexandria, they were compelled to surrender the Rosetta Stone to General Hutchinson at the end of August 1801. It was surrendered with difficulty. An eyewitness account by Professor Edward Clarke of Cambridge University, an English traveller and antiquary, records that the stone was handed over to him in the streets of Alexandria by a French officer in the presence of a fellow antiquarian. Thus, the Rosetta Stone was acquired by the British as a result of war. Colonel Turner embarked with the stone on HMS L'Egyptienne and arrived in Portsmouth in February 1802. On 11th of March, the stone was deposited at the headquarters of the Society of Antiquaries in London, and toward the end of 1802, the stone was removed from the Society of Antiquaries to the British Museum, where it has remained on exhibition there ever since and as a central object in the Egyptology collection. The stone is often cited as a good example of an object that could be restored, but since it has long been deciphered, there was no formal governmental claim for it made until 2003. In that year, the director of the Supreme Council of Antiquities in Cairo proposed a loan of the stone with a view to its permanent return. The Cairo Museum would be willing to exchange the replica it holds in return for the real stone. In 2003, the request by the Egyptian government for the stone was part of a worldwide program to seek the return of a number of objects removed from Egypt. These include the Nefertiti bust in the Berlin Museum, the statues of Hatshepsut in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and the landmark obelisk in the Place de la Concorde in Paris, which was taken from the palace in Luxor. The Egyptian request for the return of Rosetta Stone was countered with the arguments of legislative impediments and the existence of a greater audience at the British Museum. So, could the claim benefit from mediation? Now, the ethical case for returning the Rosetta Stone is rooted in principles of reparative justice. These principles can be taken into account in mediation. So if one, the national importance of the Rosetta Stone to Egypt and two, the ethically questionable circumstances in which it was acquired can be acknowledged, that could open the door to the creation of a future special relationship between the British Museum and the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Therefore, either as part of a deal in mediation or in furtherance of a special relationship brought about by mediation, other artifacts could be loaned to the British Museum for exhibition in London. For example, artifacts from the tomb of King Tutankhamun. Now, psychologically, by agreeing to take part in mediation, the participants thereby implicitly or explicitly recognize the legitimacy of each other's interests. in an artifact, even if museums do not concede to restitution. That is because mediation is a voluntary consensual process, and the willingness by the participants to take part indicates a willingness to engage with each other's perspectives and to explore potential resolutions, thereby validating each other's interests in the artifact. In other words, mediation implies recognition. So by entering into mediation, the British Museum and the Grand Egyptian Museum do not need to relive and litigate the past. Furthermore, since mediation implies recognition, the joint exploration, formulation, structuring, and agreement of terms of a mutually beneficial creative deal in resolution of the dispute is exactly what mediation can bring about. In mediation, the participants own the process and, in complete confidentiality behind closed doors, have the opportunity to determine the outcome of the dispute for themselves. So what do the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo and the British Museum have to lose by entering into mediation? More importantly, what could they both each gain by doing so? The first hurdle that they will both have to overcome is political resistance to ad hoc mediation. So there needs to be more education about how the process works, and in particular about the various interactive dimensions of cultural heritage disputes themselves. Once understood, the participants, with the help of a mediator, can then manipulate these dimensions in order to bring about a win-win-win solution that is not only in the best interests of themselves, but also of the Rosetta Stone itself. That is because restitution of the Rosetta Stone would result in this ancient artifact being placed back into its original context and community, so everyone wins. It is therefore my hope that this talk in my book will increase awareness and understanding of the potential role and benefits of ad hoc mediation in resolving cultural heritage disputes. Thank you. That's the end of the talk.
Thank you very much, Carl. Although we've run over slightly, I think, as I had fully expected, that was a tour de force. And I congratulate you, and I think everybody applauds just how interesting the content was and the erudition with which you delivered it. I must tell you how very much I enjoyed it, and I'm sure I speak for everybody.